Hello and welcome back to HEMA Fight Breakdowns. Today I'm going to be breaking down something from the past because very recently I just went to an armored fighting tournament and I got absolutely no footage out of it. So I have nothing to show or make a video about. So instead we're going to go back to 2014 and review a fight between Jake Norwood and Sean Franklin. Two really big names in the world of HEMA back then and still pretty big in the world of HEMA now post-COVID. But one of the reasons I want to go back and take a look at this is that in 2014, we were really just first starting to see the advent of steel swords being used in competition. They hadn't been around for a very long time, and there were still competitions at that time that were still using penties, the long plastic nylon swords that you really just don't even see anymore because they've basically been replaced by foam. But one of the reasons I want to go over this is not just because it's a really great fight from the past, but because you can see a lot of the early changes and iterations that steel swords started to introduce to the fight world, and more importantly, what kinds of things that you maybe can look at now that maybe we would be willing to go back to when it came to rule sets and just defining how different exchanges play out. So this is our first exchange, and the exchange itself is not particularly interesting. Sean Franklin comes forward, feints a high cut, throws an undercut, and it looks like they either both hit each other on the hands, or Jake gets the more dominant cut to the hands, and Sean almost lets go of his sword a little bit. But what really matters to me here is to point out one of the big differences between old school HEMA and new school HEMA, which is massive rings. This ring is huge. There's a ton of space that can be utilized both in terms of engagement and disengagement. And one of the other key differences you're going to see here is that both of these fencers really engage from very far away. They keep a pretty healthy distance between the two of them, and they always engage with passing steps. This is an important thing to understand and realize because nowadays most people fight with their right leg forward because they're right-handed, and they engage with simple steps, kind of Olympic fencing style, pick up your right foot, move it a couple inches forward, and then bada bang, you're in your engagement range. And the idea here is that by always engaging with a passing step, you can keep yourself safe from a lot of that simple step engagement because now they have to slowly walk themselves into your range while you always have the ability to explode forward, cover all of that distance, and run them down. But as you're going to see in some of these later exchanges, there's a little bit of a problem that can arise when both people are doing that. Now, our second exchange is pretty similar to the first. Sean once again comes forward with a feinted high attack, throws the big undercut to the hands, lands it this time, but is unable to compass step out far enough and get that hanging parry off on his right side before Jake, with a little help from a hop, manages to lever his sword over the top of the angle and hit Sean in the top of the shoulder. So, interesting exchange, but maybe not so much of a difference of execution, so much as a difference of outcome. But one of the other key things to pay attention to here is the bigness and the sweepingness of all of these motions. One of the things you'll notice when you watch more modern HEMA fencing is that everything is very tight, very quick, and doesn't have a lot of rotation. And one of the reasons for that, I think, is because of the footwork and the relation between it. When you take really big steps, it almost behooves you to take larger sweepinger motions with your sword in order for these things to kind of line up with the biometrics of the movement of your body. Sure, with taking a really large step, you could theoretically do 3 or 4 tight little things with your hands, but none of them would be particularly helpful. At the same time, if you throw a really big feint and then a really big follow-up cut, the timing of those two things is going to line up a lot better with a passing step. That being said, though, there is still the capacity for being able to interrupt these things with shorter, faster interruptions. But the problem always is that when someone comes forward with a big sweeping attack, you often have to parry it with a big sweeping motion yourself, otherwise you risk it being cleaved through. So one of the aspects that we can see here from old school fencing is that everyone has big passing step footwork, they have big passing step sweeping attacks, and there's a lot of instances where they're either trying or successfully cleaving through each other's blocks, through each other's structure, and trying to get into targets that normally would be pretty easily defended in a more modern context, but only if the attack itself was something that you could deal with. Now, the next exchange, we're going to talk about thumb grip here, because Jake, for this exchange, throws a little bit of a thrust at the exact same time as Sean throws a cut over the top. It kind of rings harmlessly off the crossguard, and then there's an exchange later where it looks like somebody hits somebody in the arms, but, half of it goes off of camera. But I really want to focus in on this thrust, because this is a very different thing than the kind of thing we see today, because today we see a lot of thumb grip. Thumb grip, one of the advantages it gives you is it allows you to simply extend your arms forward and basically be in that thrusting position. But because Jake and Sean both here fight out of hammer grip, where their crossguard is in line with their knuckles, in order to get into a thrusting position, you can see here Jake has to wind his hands up. He goes from this kind of full long point, plow style position where he's down in his lower left area, and he winds it up into his upper left area. And you can see him twist his wrists and flare his left elbow and pull his left shoulder up in order to get into that spot. And the issue with this sort of motion is that it's really big, it's a little bit slow, and it really exposes the hands as a target. You can see by watching the slow-mo here that if Sean had diverted his downward cut pretty much to the left or the right, he would have been able to hit either one of Jake's arms on its way up. He might have gotten stabbed in the process, but that's neither here nor there. The idea here is that thumb grip is one of those newer solutions to this exact same problem, where you can do the exact same motion, extend your arms forward, go into that thrust, but you don't have to do all the winding, you don't have to pick a side, and you don't have to expose so much of your arms. But there is still an advantage to thrusting in this way. It is that this winding motion, as it goes up onto one side, is really, really good at defending that specific side and cuts that attack really heavily downward on that specific side. One thing that I've pointed out in other videos sometimes is that this winding thrust is kind of gone away from the world of HEMA, but it was really, really, really good at countering people who would come in with a passing step on their dominant side and throw something straight at your head, which is obviously what Jake was trying to accomplish here, and something that Sean has now thrown a couple times, or at least feinted a couple times in a row. So we see our adaptations, we see the game plan, and we see the meta of old school HEMA, and we can understand how it works, but at the same time, we can also see why some of these innovations were eventually adopted, like thumb grip. At the end of the day, while doing this kind of winding thrust is something you can keep in your back pocket, thrusting in that way all the time is going to lead to your arms getting chopped off probably 7 or 8 times out of 10. Now, I would be remiss if I missed one of the biggest key features that made old school HEMA so different, and that was the grappling. The willingness to grapple from both participants, the willingness to allow grappling to continue from the judges and directors, and sometimes the willingness for people to end up in rather silly splayed out positions on the floor when grappling ended up not working out so great. But in this exchange, we get really all 3 of those. Right out of the gate, Sean Franklin explodes forward with a big cut to the head that forces a response from Jake, but as you can see, even once Jake manages to get his parry in there, Sean is already slamming into his body and initiating that grapple. It's obvious that the grapple was the one thing he was going for here, to the extent that even if Jake had maybe not put up so much of a defense, Sean maybe still would not have been able to get a great cut off on the head before he managed to run into his opponent. But another thing that we can understand here is that this is a pretty big feature of passing step style footwork. The occasion is always going to happen when 2 people who always use passing steps to initiate their engagement both do so at the same time, that they're probably going to slam into each other a lot. And as a result, old school HEMAists were very aware of what to do when they ended up in this position. So, right as we get to the slam, where both fencers are right up against each other, chest to chest, we can already see Sean starting to integrate his grappling into this exchange. He is snaking his left arm over the right arm of Jake in order to control his sword arm. And that's a really great strategy in any grapple situation, because, of course, you can only score points once you've managed to control the point-scoring implement of your opponent. After they start to spin around and face the same direction a little bit, Sean throws a descending cut that looks like it actually lands pretty okay, but just doesn't get called by the judges. And this is another feature of old school HEMA, which is that people were a lot more willing to throw things out that they thought were questionable. Sometimes that involved throwing things out that really weren't that questionable at all, like this cut, which is, in my opinion, just fine. But it does mean that a lot of things were allowed to continue to the point where they could end up as grapple exchanges when maybe they weren't always intended to be. But after we get this little cut, there is an attempt by Jake to shove his left hand back into the engagement, tie up Sean's other arm. And then you can see that Jake manages to reverse the situation here as he puts his left arm over the head of Sean, putting him in a kind of like chancery headlock as they both careen off to the left side of the frame. And as the camera readjusts, we come back to them both flat on their bellies on the ground. Now, the question here is that from an old school HEMA perspective, this is just another grapple exchange, but who do you call it for? And I believe at the end of this exchange, they did eventually give the cut to the top of the head to Sean. But the simple reality here is that in a situation where you even are allowed to throw and can get points for throwing the opponent, this is definitely not a situation where you could say one person was in a completely dominant position. You can say, obviously, Jake had that over-the-top headlock, but at the end of the day, his sword arm was still very much bound up and unable to be used when they both hit the ground, so you could really pretty much give it to nobody. At the end of the day, though, one of the things to maybe learn from here is that in the modern day HEMA, not a lot of people really go for these grapple style exchanges. And I think it's something that a lot of people should maybe learn how to do. Learn how to, just like Sean here, shoot yourself directly into an engagement where you know you're not going to get slammed in the head, and then end up in these grapple style situations. Because if you know how to do that very effectively and your opponent has no idea what to do when they're in that situation, you can put yourself in a pretty dominant place where if they don't know what's going on, you can be the one who always ends up coming out on top. Even to the point where it's worth taking a couple shots, maybe to the hands or to the legs as you charge in, because if you can get more dominant points out of this situation more often, well, it's a pretty viable strategy. A lot of tournaments still allow you to grapple, maybe not throw, and if you're the person who can come out on top in that situation, you almost have an obligation to figure out how to get yourself in that situation as frequently as possible. So, what have we learned here? Well, maybe some wider rings might lead to some better distance management. Maybe some passing step footwork might lead to some more grappling. But maybe at the end of the day, one of the real reasons that we don't see this kind of fencing anymore is because it's just a little bit obsolete. A lot of the things that we saw here were kinds of exchanges that can only happen when two people are basically fencing in a similar manner. And as we started to see fencing change over the years, again, pre-COVID and certainly post-COVID, what we saw was that a lot of the people who fenced this way were getting picked apart by the people who were better able to tightly and more quickly tag them in the hands, tag them in the leg, tag them maybe even in the head, and then get out of range from that big passing step. And maybe it's something that you can put into your repertoire, into your tool belt, and pull out every once in a while. But to make it the mainstay of your fencing style probably just won't work so well for you anymore. But that's okay, because at the end of the day, the past exists for us to learn from, and if you can't watch some old school HEMA fencing and say, hey, maybe that'll work and maybe that won't work, well, then you're probably not going to be able to improve much on your own anyway. So, I'm not going to have another video this week because I'm going to AGO, and I will see you next week with another video, hopefully of AGO.